We named today's title of the event Always Promising, the Future of Latin America. And meant it to be a little, have a couple double meanings, I guess one would say. On the one hand, Latin America always seems to be promising. It always seems it's about like it might be able to take off with economic growth, might be on the verge of putting together the correct conditions for long-run democratic institutions and so forth. But somehow over history, it doesn't always live up to its promise. But today we're going to talk about the extent to which that might be the case over the course of the next 35 years or more. And we wanted to look at it from multiple dimensions because Latin America is a very rich and diverse place, and there's a lot of a diverse number of ways of thinking about it and looking at it. So today we're going to get an understanding of the future of Latin America and its democratic institutions and democracy, the future prospects for economic development, future prospects for public health and human development, and future prospects on the environment. And Boston University, I'm proud to say, actually has somebody who specializes in each of these dimensions, which is really exciting. I don't think there's too many universities in town that could boast that. So we're going to hear very short 6 to 8 minute presentations from each of our panelists, and then we hope to have a dialogue with you folks about the future of Latin America. Let me introduce all of them to you at the same time so we can go through this smoothly. I think we'll start with Professor Carlos Blanco. He's a visiting professor in the Department of International Relations here at BU. He's a former cabinet level minister in Venezuela and a prolific writer and thinking on Venezuelan and Latin American issues in general. His most recent book is called Revolution and Disillusion, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. And he'll be talking to us about the future of democracy and institution building in the region. I think the second speaker will be Professor Shane Hunt from the Economics Department. He is a Professor Emeritus in the Economics Department here at BU. He's been working on Peruvian economic development and economic development in Latin America for quite a long time. He was a visiting professor at the Central Bank of Peru at two different periods, and has a long history of writing, thinking, and advising in Latin America on economic development. Our third speaker will be Kirk Dearden from the School of Public Health. He will be talking about public health and human development dimensions. For the past 17 years, he's been providing technical assistance to NGOs and nonprofits to help them think about the delivery of their health services, and primarily in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then lastly, we'll hear about the future of the environment in Latin America from Professor Robert Kaufman. He's in the Department of Geography and Environment, and he's part of a really exciting multi-university interdisciplinary project on the future of the Amazon rainforest from an environmental perspective and from an economic development perspective. So please help me in welcoming all of these folks. We'll start with Carlos.
Gracias. Well, now it's very difficult to talk about the future. More difficult than a few weeks ago, than like 35 days ago. A few months ago, the forecast for the region was bright, but suddenly it changed, as we know. Many interrogations are out there, and the experience shows that prosperity and decadence go approximately at the same pace of that of international economy. But regardless of recent upswings in Latin America, there are many people in poverty and under major social stress. This region has experienced different and even contradictory policies, from the export-led model to the import substitution on industrialization and populism, to neoliberalism and market-oriented economies, and now to this new reddish or pink wave, in some cases more inclined to social justice, and in other cases populist and frequently authoritarian. The point that I want to make today is that the problem is not, at least mainly, about policies, but about institutional structures in which these policies are conceived, approved, performed, and evaluated. The most important problem is the Latin American state and the institutional setting that it embodies and represents. From this approach, the critical task for the region is the reform of the state that implies a major revamp of the most important public institutions, a strategic transformation of relations between the state and the civil society, and the creation of new conditions for civil society organizations' development. The reform of the state is a political process which entails redistribution of political power, meaning an overhaul of actors, rules, and relationships with new winners and losers. It is not mostly an administrative or technical course of action, but a political struggle that at some point come together in an institutional setting. Some of the most important elements of the reform of the state include, first, political parties reforms. These reforms imply a profound overhaul of political parties, replacing their internal authoritarianism through the advance on democratic procedures for selecting their leaders and candidates, and an increased democratic relationship with the societies in which they are embedded. It also means open organizations in which internal discipline should not conceal murky financial practices and difficulties for citizens' oversight. Nevertheless, it is highly improbable to have again the traditional mass-based parties that Latin America enjoyed for decades. More flexible electoral systems. Each system has its pros and cons. One of the most important demands of voters is about their lack of representation. New channels should be open, but being aware that broad sources of representation will make more difficult to aggregate interests when it is more needed due to social fragmentation. It requires strong electoral institutions capable of punishing electoral transgressions. Thirdly, reforms for enhancing the role of NGOs. A new institutional arrangement should incorporate these structures to complement the aggregation of interest that shaky political parties may not do well and timely. Decentralization. This transformation not only suggests a more solid role of the subnational levels, as is widely understood, but a tool to counterbalance extreme historical Latin American presidentialism. Parliamentary system could be a way to tackle the problem, but it has not solid roots in the region's traditions. Fifthly, reform of the presidency of the republics. President's mythical power is a passport to failure in a context of weak institutions. As you know, Latin American presidents are heirs of the caudillos of the 19th century, and they symbolize a lot of power, which most of the time is a failed or mythical one. Presidencies necessitate modernization as the first step to reform public administration with more professional criteria. Reform of the armed forces. I sustain the Latin American military is still there, and from time to time is heard some saber rattling. The external defense mission was substituted a long time ago by the internal security approach in the last authoritarian wave. But the new roles are not very clear in all countries, and subordination to duly elected civilian leaders is not always there. A major impulse for military institutionalization is required, not only for guaranteeing borders, but also for preventing incursions from other nations' promoted irregular forces. Seventh, a set of integrated public, economic, and social policies is required, with a proper assessment of their social consequences in the short and long run. They should be able to integrate the excluded in the economic and social development process. It is important to understand that the trickle-down approach failed and poor sectors are not waiting anymore. Reform of the constitutional realm is critically required. Due to the role of the media in shaping public opinion, it is and will be necessary a strong impulse to new networks capable to express new sectors in fragmented societies with their diversity and even including the disorganized structure. With these remarks, I think that the conception of the reform of the state brings for Latin America a better democracy. But it has been a process that have been tried to pursue, being pursued since several years ago, and it has failed in many countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Hunt,
How many minutes did you say?
around 6 to 8 minutes.
Okay, 6 to 8 minutes. Going to talk really fast. I was very pleased that the charge we had was to make a forecast 35 years into the future rather than 6 months. If it had been 6 months, I would have been totally disarmed. But forecasting 35 years into the future, I think it is appropriate to look at the past and make some tentative projections from the past into the future, considering that the next 3 years can be treated just as a blip, although it's going to be a rather painful blip in all probability. And in looking back at the past, I thought it would be best to start with a concept, a literature that was much discussed in economics some 20 or 30 years ago, that centered on the term convergence theory. And what convergence was all about was the idea that there is a process of convergence between countries of different levels of development, whereby countries will converge to approximately the same level. That doesn't mean the rich countries sink. The idea of convergence is that the relatively less developed countries will grow faster and catch up with the countries that are more developed. And there are a number of examples of this in history of the last couple of centuries, which inspired this to be put into theoretical formulation by various economists. And I'll mention just a couple of those very quickly. One in the 19th century, the contrast between England and Germany from 1820 to 1870 or 1880. In 1820, England was so far ahead of all the rest of the countries of the world in terms of industrialization and GNP, although such a concept was not yet measured, that it seemed beyond belief that other countries would catch up. And yet within 50 years, Germany did catch up. And this extraordinary change in the relative position of England and Germany was attributed to two factors in particular. And these are the two factors that drive this idea of convergence generally. One is technological transfer. Countries that are behind, relatively less developed, have great opportunities for economic progress simply by adopting and adapting the technologies that have already been developed in the more developed countries. And it's easier to adopt and adapt than it is to think up things brand new. And that was one factor. And the other factor was the idea that a relatively more developed country can have institutions that were developed for a particular purpose in the past, but are no longer very useful in forging ahead. In the case of England, the institutions that were identified were a banking system which was oriented toward commercial activity, in other words, promoting commerce, and an education system that was oriented toward training administrators to supervise an empire. And the Germans, on the other hand, developed new kinds of institutions that were much more suitable for industrial development, namely an education system based on science and technology, and a banking system that was based on industrial development with industrial banks rather than commercial banks. So that was one example of convergence. Another example was Western Europe versus the United States in the decades after World War II. I should say Western Europe and also Japan. The other countries of the OECD, the relatively more developed countries, were all catching up with the United States. And within those countries, the relatively less developed were growing faster. In the case of Europe, during the second half of the 20th century, the country that grew the fastest was Italy. Now, we all know of Italy as that hopelessly inefficient country with a political system that is a disaster and a bureaucracy that is hopelessly corrupt, but it grew the fastest of any country in Europe. Again, an example of convergence. And I might say that why Italy grew so fast, in large part, was because they could absorb into the industrial developed north of Italy a very large labor force from the south of Italy, which kept wages down, and as they transferred to northern Italy, their incomes went up substantially. Okay, what about Latin America in the context of convergence? Hasn't converged very much. If you look at the statistics over the course of the 20th century, what you can at least say is that Latin America has fallen no further behind. Latin America did fall behind quite disastrously during the 19th century. The political disorganization of the wars of independence and the post-independence period was very lamentable in terms of the economic stagnation that it placed upon virtually all countries of Latin America. During the same time that Europe and the United States were growing, not fast, but continuously. In the 20th century, Latin America and the United States have more or less maintained a parity in terms of economic growth, which is to say that Latin America has remained at the same level of relative poverty compared to the United States. Its GNP per capita has remained approximately 20% of what it is in the United States. There are differences within countries, and there is only one country in Latin America which has actually grown faster than the United States over the course of the whole 20th century, and that's Brazil. And there is one country which has slumped terribly relative to the United States, or relative to virtually any other country you would care to identify, and that's Argentina. And between the extremes of Argentina and Brazil, there are the other countries of Latin America arrayed along a line. And as you look at these countries, you see, in terms of their growth records over the course of the 20th century, you see some periods of extraordinarily high growth, particularly a period referred to by some as the Golden Age, which was from the immediate post-war period, from about 1950 to the first oil price shock in 1973. And then you see other areas that are truly lamentable. The two most lamentable periods being the Great Depression, which was lamentable everywhere. We better identify which Great Depression we're talking about these days, right? I'm referring to the 1930s. And the other period which was lamentable was the 1980s, the so-called lost decade, where virtually all countries of Latin America fell into recession as a result of the so-called debt crisis. The only country in Latin America which managed to avoid excessive foreign borrowing and foreign indebtedness and maintained its growth rate throughout the 1980s was Colombia. And the finance minister of Colombia at that time is now a resident of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And if you ever meet Rodrigo Botero at a seminar around here, you can congratulate him, because he was the only the person who managed to fight off the bankers from New York who kept trying to throw money at him. So you have these examples of countries that have grown fast, and you have the examples of countries that have survived tough periods like the 1980s. But what you see in general is spurts of growth and then periods of falling back. And the falling back at times can be caused by external factors like a Great Depression, a worldwide depression overwhelming the region, or New York bankers unwisely throwing money at you. But there are a lot of other examples of fallback and fallow periods of economic growth for domestic reasons that are intimately related to what Professor Blanco has just been talking about. A problem of unstable institutions. And certainly, if you look at a comparison between Brazil and Argentina, for example, the instability of Argentine institutions and the battering that Argentine institutions have taken over the course of the decades is really striking to see. And you see a country which has not only suffered in terms of inflation, but you see a country that has had a once excellent public health system deteriorate, and a once excellent educational system deteriorate, a judicial system that has been had its difficulties, to say the least, an armed forces as an institution, which for various reasons has inserted itself into the political game in ways that compromise its integrity as an institution. And so you do find these examples throughout Latin America of countries that have had their economic progress suffer because of instability of institutions. And very often, asking why the institutions are so unstable, you have to go back to look at the political dynamic in these countries, the social tensions, the class conflict, which has brought various countries at various times to the point of civil war, and has certainly compromised these institutions. So, in terms of what the next 35 years is going to look like, well, I hope I've given you a sophisticated reason for saying I don't really know, because it is a tension between the forces of convergence on the one hand, which certainly benefit countries like Latin America that are prepared to take advantage of being relatively backward vis-a-vis the United States and Europe, adopt those technologies and move forward. But you also have these elements of instability, which from time to time do compromise economic growth. And I would say, ending, that I think you have to start looking at different countries in Latin America. And if you had to put your finger on countries that look to be in good shape in terms of the quality of their institutions, the quality of their political system, and therefore their prospects for economic growth, I would put my fingers on Brazil and Chile. And if I put my finger on Brazil, a country as large as Brazil, for a country that I think is going to continue to forge ahead, and may I say, I think it's going to continue to forge ahead because all the Brazilians think so too, and that kind of optimism they have is one extremely positive element. But if a country as big as Brazil will forge ahead, well, it'll drag the rest of South America with it at least. Maybe not Central America, but South America for sure. Thank you.
In some ways, I'm going to follow the same format that Professor Hunt did and talk a little bit about the past, a little bit about the present, a little bit about the future. And I'd like to describe some broad trends, what we call the epidemiologic transition, the demographic transition, the nutrition transition, and then changes in delivery of health services. So starting off where we've been, just a couple of highlights. As you probably know, we've had very high fertility in Latin America, very low levels of contraception, heavily rural populations. A lot of the major causes of death are infectious in nature, acute respiratory infections, pneumonia, diarrhea, malnutrition, and so forth. We've had high rates of acute malnutrition, protein energy malnutrition. Do I need to speak up? Can people in the back hear me? Okay, I have a soft voice. I'll speak a little louder. High infant mortality rates. And as you're well aware, a lot of sort of social challenges. One that I'm working on is paternal absence, but there are also problems with street children, drugs, and so forth. I think it goes without saying that there are huge inequities in the delivery of health services. And generally speaking, weak ministries of health. They've been weak in their delivery of health services. And so NGOs have taken a fairly large role in the provision of health care. And historically, there's been a fair amount of funding for Latin America from bilateral donors. So where we're at now, I think in general, the picture is a little bit rosier for Latin American public health than it is perhaps for some of these other sectors. Low fertility, and it's dropping, relatively high use of contraception. The total fertility rate in Latin America as a region is 2.5, so on average, women have 2.5 children. And it won't be long before several countries drop below replacement fertility, which is 2.1. They have the highest net immigration rate in the world. There's a lot of urbanization. For example, 78% of Latin America is currently urban, projected to increase to 89% by 2050. Urban areas are generally better off than rural areas, but that's not always a safe assumption. There are huge pockets of poverty and lack of access, even in urban areas. In terms of epidemiology, there's this huge transition in cause of death. So we're moving away from infectious diseases to chronic illnesses. And I made a little fact sheet that I can pass around that basically talks about changes in cause of death. And this is for the, globally, not specifically for Latin America. But if you look at the bottom, you'll see how much things are changing. There's been almost a near disappearance of protein energy malnutrition, acute malnutrition. What has now taken its place is chronic malnutrition, which is really more driven by micronutrient deficiencies, long-term stunting of children. There have been huge decreases in infant mortality. I brought an article. I spent 4 months this year in Peru, and I brought an article from the local paper about changes in infant mortality. So I'm happy to pass that around. There are 2 sections to it. But I think when you look at changes in infant mortality, which is often regarded as one of the best indicators of the well-being of a country, you have to look at discrepancies. So, for example, in urban areas, the infant mortality is 17 per 1,000 live births. In rural areas, it's 27. While infant mortality is decreasing, there are some other challenges. Neonatal mortality in the first 28 days of life is still quite high and been ignored. Maternal mortality, again, quite high, been ignored. In terms of other discrepancies, there are large discrepancies in chronic undernutrition. So, for example, 27% of children in Peru are chronically malnourished. But then if you look at certain departments like Huancavelica, it's up at 47%, and Tacna is down at 9%. So there are huge discrepancies. There's increased institutionalization of antenatal care and delivery at clinics and hospitals. Increases or improvements in community mobilization for health services. A huge change has been decentralization of health services and resources away from capitals and centers of government. There's also been an increase in a number of countries, for example, Peru and Bolivia, in the delivery of universal health care, at least for women and children. I'd argue that while in theory these programs are good, there are major problems. Women don't know about these services, even though a clinic is right next to their house. The services aren't as good as private services and so forth. So thinking about the future in some ways forward, I think it's going to be a huge challenge for many Latin American countries to simultaneously deal with infectious diseases, which is what they have now, as well as chronic diseases. It's really a double burden that a lot of developed countries haven't necessarily experienced. I think there's going to have to be a greater focus on neonatal health, maternal health, as well as things like accidents, obesity, and a lot of the problems that we suffer from. We're going to have to approach health in an integrated fashion. That sounds intuitive, but the pendulum has really swung in global health towards focusing on specific diseases like malaria at the exclusion of diarrhea or pneumonia. So we need to make sure that pendulum swings back so we look in an integrated fashion at all of these illnesses. Mobilization of community goes without saying. We need to focus more on prevention. Again, something that would seem intuitive, but I think we tend to rush out and want to focus on severe malnutrition in kids when in fact more kids are dying of mild and moderate levels of malnutrition than severe. So again, prevention is the name of the game. We need to assess the cost effectiveness of a variety of programs. We charge out and do all these programs without really knowing whether they work, whether it's the ministry level or by NGOs. One thing that we ought to consider doing is identifying what I would call positive deviant countries. These are countries that, in spite of their poverty, have a positive health outcome. Probably the best choice would be infant mortality. How is it that some countries in Latin America have good outcomes, even though they're experiencing poverty? And you can look at a couple of case studies like Costa Rica and Cuba, but I'm not sure how relevant those are for Latin American countries. Maybe a more appropriate paradigm is to look at ministers of health and governments that commit, at least in the short run, to some major changes in investment in healthcare. I think there needs to be an expansion of public-private alliances. If you talk to almost anybody in Latin America, I'll say they'd rather go to a private physician than a public one because the services are a lot better. And I think there needs to be more experimentation with a variety of ways in delivering health services. For example, microinsurance, microcredit combined with other services, conditional cash transfers, which are quite common in Mexico and Brazil. And then even more emphasis on provision of services by the government. I think at least one of the co-presenters here has mentioned this. I think NGOs need to play a facilitating role of technical assistance in the provision of health services rather than being direct implementers of health services. They really need to help governments do that. Okay. And then finally, we need better research to identify and act upon the broad factors that affect health. It's important in public health not just to focus on public health issues, but education of girls, economic development, and so forth. In my personal opinion, these have as much to do with explaining improvements in health as anything that we've done in particular. And then looking for promising models of health delivery, documenting their impact and scaling up. Thank you.
And finish this part of the discussion on the environment, Professor Robert Kaufman.
Okay, well, thanks, and I apologize in advance. I can't remember the last time I gave a talk without PowerPoint slides or statistical results, so you'll forgive me if I'm lost at times. And because of that, I'm really glad I'm allowed to go last and that way try and build on what other people said. So I'm thinking about the environment and Brazil, and in particular the Brazilian Amazon and the Amazon basin in general. And it really is an interesting place to work with regards to the environment, because this is where all the environmental problems are going to play out over the next 35 years, which I just learned is the near-term future, apparently. And so when you think about things like climate change, when you think about things like loss of biodiversity, about feeding the planet, it's all going to happen in the Amazon, or it's the decisions we make and the implications of the choices we make are all going to play out in the Amazon, in part because this is the last large remaining stretch of natural environment left on the planet. And so one of the first issues I often hear when we talk about political concerns about the Amazon is issues of sovereignty. And one of the things I like to think about is forget about sovereignty. It's an illusion now, because really what you have is a world in which capital will move across borders and will find any place where it can earn a high rate of return. And so the decisions that get made in the Amazon are not going to be necessarily the decisions made just by Brazilians, but they're really going to be the decisions made by worldwide capital. And that goes back to a little something that we talked about with regard to convergence and technical change, in that if you look at what's happening now in the Amazon, the biggest kind of environmental change or the biggest cause of deforestation is really the introduction of soybean agriculture and cattle ranching to the region. And these crops are not being grown to feed Brazilians, even though Brazilians will eat some soybeans and will eat some hamburgers. But really, the soybeans are being grown for the Chinese market, and roads are being designed and built for that market. And so capital is flowing into that region, and that's what's going to drive this. And we like to think, well, it's a Chinese, then maybe we can isolate it to a Chinese issue or a Brazilian issue, but really those decisions play out worldwide, even for us here at home, in that if we decide, or if global capital decides that soybeans are not to be grown in the Brazilian Amazon, there's still going to be this huge increase in demand for soybeans, which simply means that you and I here in the United States will pay more for soybeans. There's one big world market for soybeans, for oil, for cattle, and that's a consequence of this globalized, converging world that you can't make individual decisions. The other thing I want to return to is this idea of institutions, political institutions, because one of the, quote, hopes for the Amazon is if we want to develop the Amazon, and actually let me step back, the other aspect of convergence is if we accept convergence theory also applies to natural environments. And so when you look at natural environments and convergence, what does that imply? It implies a Brazil that looks very much like the United States in terms of natural environments. What does the United States look like? It looks like Great Plains that have been converted to cornfields and cattle pasture. And that's what, barring any kind of purposeful policy, that's what economic convergence means for Brazil. It means most of the rainforest will be gone in 35 years to feed people, to feed cattle, and perhaps as a means of slowing climate change, even though we'll see how that plays out. So if that is not a vision of convergence that we want to see actualized, what do we do about it? Well, up until now, we've had these kind of command and control strategies for controlling deforestation. So areas in Brazil have been, quote, roped off for further development. They've been set up as indigenous areas or reserves where economic development is not to occur. But satellite images indicate that those kind of efforts at command and control strategy have been somewhat less than successful. And in part, it's very difficult to enforce efforts to prevent deforestation in an area the size of Rhode Island. You know, think about it. People can sneak into Rhode Island in and out very easily. Even Mo Vaughn did it for several years here and never got caught. So how do we try and avoid that kind of reliance on command and control? Well, the big hope are these market-based policies. So recently with Kyoto Protocol, we have this idea of RED, which is, oh God, what is it? Reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, where the idea is to kind of pay people to set up market incentives to preserve the Amazon, to grow cattle or soybeans in a way that we in the developed world and globally as well think are better for the Amazon and better for world markets and better for global climate and better for species. The problem is, when you look at these kind of policies on paper, they are very attractive economically. It makes perfect sense. The problem is, if you do not have the institutions to kind of set up these market-based policies or enforce these market-based policies, they're doomed to failure. So really, you know, and I've almost used my 6 minutes, really, the environment is going to reflect the success and or failures of all these other aspects that people before me talked about. Technical transfer, what kind of technology are we going to transfer into the Amazon basin? What kind of political institutions will the local governments be able to set up? And ultimately, how healthy are the people going to be who live in that area? And that's what's going to determine the health of the Amazon. And on a, I don't know whether it's a bright note or a sour note, but ultimately, I hate to say it, I think the health of the Amazon basin is really going to reflect the health of the planet for human beings in general. In that, if we see the Amazon turned into something that looks like the United States, I do not think that bodes well for the global environment. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Let's have a round of applause for all four of our speakers. And now we have how much time for question and answer? Okay. Let me take, we have a microphone over here. We need you to speak in the microphone, one, so everyone can hear us, and two, for recording purposes. And it looks like we have someone who can hand the mic to our speakers. So let me take small clusters of questions, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond to clusters of them. So please raise your hand if you have a question. Start here in the front.
Professor, in the American West, the Army went out. We set up forts for enforcement of laws and property rights. Given Latin America's aversion to a powerful military and Brazil's recent experience, and they do believe in sovereignty over there. They don't want to see our military or other American NGOs enforcing the laws. Who do you see as the main enforcement tool?
Thanks. Let me take it. Others? No. Yeah.
Wow.
Here we go.
Hi, I was wondering if any of our speakers today saw a tension between multilateral trade agreements and the idea of technology transfer within the convergence theory. If there was a limit by limiting or protecting intellectual property rights, or by limiting restrictions on investment in countries, if that is at all impacting an idea of technology transfer and convergence.
Yeah, thanks.
Please
I'm
stand.
interested.
It's hard to see when you're that far back. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm interested in the rural sector of Latin America and what you think this vision might look like in 35 years, specifically whether smallholder agriculture has any place in it, and how what is done or not done on that can affect all of these things we're talking about: growth, stability, health, the environment. Thanks.
Okay, one more, and then we'll.
Hi, I'm Rachel Thrasher, one of the fellows at.
I'm sorry, I'm just informed that this gentleman directed this question to me, and I'm really deaf. I didn't hear a thing. Could you please restate the question? I'm sorry, just come down and
Look you in the eye.
So I'm thinking about the rural sector in this short to medium term future of Latin America, and whether smallholder farmers have any place in that, and how the policy there will affect any kind of growth or stability in that area.
Okay, we'll take one more, and then we'll answer these as a group. But Rachel, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm Rachel Thrasher, one of the fellows here at Pardee. And my question was also for you, Professor Hunt, but for any of the panelists that want to talk. I was wondering about the proliferation of bilateral free trade agreements, especially those with the U.S., whether or not you saw that as contributing to or taking away from convergence or political instability in the region.
Okay, let's answer this question. These questions, most of them for Professor Hunt.
Yeah, well, they were great questions. I wish I had answers. Both the questions are very sector specific, and I was operating at quite a global level, and wildly hazarding some generalizations at the global level. And so when one gets down to the specific sectors, it becomes even more difficult to hazard guesses about the future. With respect to the question about the free trade agreements, I guess I would say that free trade agreements are perhaps a little exaggerated in their importance, because what has really happened in the last 50 years, or 100 years even, is an explosion of international trade, largely on the basis of a decline of transportation and communications costs, and also on the basis of multilateral negotiations to bring down trade barriers. And those two effects are so dominant in the explosion of trade that has occurred in the world that the additional effect of free trade agreements seems to me of relatively minor importance. And it's kind of curious because the free trade agreements are so politically contentious, particularly the Colombian agreement that seems to be bouncing around these days. And it has been commented on in a seminar that we attended recently here at BU that when you talk about, this is what the speaker said, when you talk to people about the Colombian Free Trade Agreement, people who are opposed to it, their argument is mostly jobs are going to China. My job is going to China, and it's a question of beating up on whomever you can beat up on, namely Colombia, because you're really worried about China. Now, China is a metaphor for globalization and world trade generally, and globalization and world trade certainly does bring its disruptions. It has brought a tremendous gain, though, and so I would say that, sure, in the long run, convergence, expanded trade is definitely going to be part of it. And whether it is down to the specifics of free trade agreements or is somewhat more general in terms of multilateral negotiations to make sure that trade is more or less unimpeded, I don't think that's a really big issue. On the question of rural and smallholder agriculture in this new world, well, gosh, I don't know what to say. You try to look at some parallels today, and you look at the United States and see that smallhold agriculture has been virtually wiped out, and then you look at Europe and you see that smallholder agriculture is holding on grimly and will block all the highways in your country if you try to turn against it, as is the case in France. So because of the political clout that the rural sector often has, maybe you'll just have smallholder agriculture surviving in an expanding world economy because they've got the clout to survive. Like 2 senators per state.
Yeah, you know, I guess my comment is, first of all, going back, I really believe this notion that sovereignty comes from, you know, whose army is in a place is old-fashioned now. It's whose money is flowing in there and who's making those decisions. And the other thing is, you know, even if you dispatch the Brazilian army out there, the question is, whose interests are they going to be enforcing? If you look at the United States, there are lots of Western movies that kind of portray the lone homesteader trying to hold out against, you know, the big cattle rancher, and the army always coming down on the side of the big cattle rancher. So, you know, I really believe the institutions have to be strengthened such that they can then manage domestically what's going on, and also any kind of market-based incentives can really have some bite in them, as opposed to just on paper, in theory they work, but there's no way to really implement them.
Another round of questions. In the back.
Thank you. I'm wondering about the role of Latin America in the future with regards to the rest of the world, especially the developing world. There's now tons of flights between South America and Europe or North America, between Africa and Europe or North America, but there's only 2 flights between South America and Africa. And Africa could learn much more from South America than from Europe, because we Latin Americans have this brain that kind of wants to think big, but we still have this ridiculous institutional problems that we share with Africa. So I'm wondering, what do you think Latin America could do to be more of a bridge between the needs of the poor, of the poorest of the poor, and the skills that come with education and health and stuff that Latin America enjoyed in the recent past? And even though we may be converging in odd ways, we still should be able to give a hand, especially to Africa. Thank you.
Couple more.
Hello again. I was wondering if, since institution building has clearly come out as one of the priorities today in what we want to see for the future in Latin America, if anyone might be able to critique some of the institution building programs within the development industry, within the World Bank, within other NGOs that are working in the area, some best practices or thoughts for the future.
Up here in the front.
I found Carlos's talk really, really interesting, and I'm particularly concerned that economic instability is once again going to fuel political instability in a number of Latin American countries. Yeah, I found Carlos's talk about political institutions fascinating, and I'm really concerned for many Latin American countries that the collapse of commodity prices will lead to political instability. So as I was going over my notes from your talk, you talk about political fragmentation and the failure of the political party system to aggregate interests. And it reminds me a lot of the old stories about creating parliamentary systems in Japan and Germany as a way of somehow creating stability. In a way, it was like an overnight trick. Here, we have the way. We're going to stop the political instability of these countries by using parliamentary systems. But I wonder in Latin America whether the real problem isn't some really deep economic inequality that we're not going to find an overnight trick. It's not going to be about political reform. It is only going to happen through economic change, a reduction in inequality, so that there is an aggregation of interest besides these mass movements of a huge number of phenomenally poor people who aggregate pretty well into the streets. So I wish you would just tell me, if you could say, please World Bank or please USAID or whatever, what is it? What is it we could hope for? What is that policy that we could, what is that silver bullet that would somehow make political institutions and political parties, if you want, more stable?
One more? One more back there? Okay, let's respond to these people.
Thank you. Well, I have no answers for many of these questions, but I would say the following. First, on the Latin America-Africa relation and how can Latin America provide some experiences to African countries. I have no doubt that some interchange can be done on this, but what I feel is that Latin American countries are not integrated themselves in a broad sense. In problems about sovereignty, about relations, cultural and political relations are not solved. Now we have a trend with this new left-leaning countries, governments that are taking care of a broader relations among them. But I think that is not working very well for the whole region. And it's going to be difficult to have broader relations with other regions of the world, which I think should be a good proposal. The role of the World Bank and some other multilateral organizations is difficult to have a proper appraisal of their roles, because I have found that, for instance, the World Bank, when the decentralization process began in some countries in Latin America, was proposing, the best practices for decentralization at the local level. And this organization didn't take care of the medium level, of the state or department level. And they were promoting decentralization at the municipal, local level without taking any notice that there was a major change at the medium national level. And I think this is sometimes the problem with this organization that have a bureaucracy that works lagging some of the best practices that they can find in Latin America, but just behind the time needed to adopt them. And regarding to the problems of a parliamentary system, I think that the best way to integrate different social sectors and political sectors as well is through decentralization. I think decentralization is the most important approach that Latin America can have to counterbalance presidentialism, centralism in the region. I must say that there have been some very important problems in Latin American decentralization. First one is that decentralization in some countries has been conceived as the complete opposite to centralism. And in some cases has meant a rupture, a radical rupture with a central national government, creating new problems at the local or regional level. And the other thing is that when central governments or national governments do not take care of what is happening at the local or regional level, the problems that the national level had and that wanted to be solved through decentralization appear in some cases worse than they were before. You know, like corruption, like clientelism, patronage, in more difficult ways to solve. And I agree, Anne, with the need of economic change. But the point that I wanted to make is that it's not about policies. We can have sound policies, and we have had sound policies in Latin America, but the institutions that are designed to perform these policies don't work, or at least don't work well. And I think the first wave of reforms of the late 80s and early 90s, you know, the debt crisis, new economic approach, new policies, the Washington Consensus policies, did a lot regarding to policies, and some institutional reforms related to economic institutions. But there were a lot of problems not solved, and I think the most important issue for solving poverty and inequality problems is to answer the question how the poor can be involved in the solution of their problem. Because if not, you know, just policies from the state, I think we're going to reproduce, and I think what is happening in many social programs is that they try to solve the problem, but actually they're reproducing poverty and reproducing the power relationship between the state and the poor. And that, I think that's the most important cause of poverty reproduction in the region. Thank you.
Kurt, do you want to respond to
I just wanted to comment quickly about the relationship between Latin America and Africa. I'm hard-pressed to think of some successful models coming out of Latin American public health that can then be transferred to Africa. And I think the situation historically and in terms of socioeconomic status is so different that I can't really think of examples except maybe some isolated cases of eradicating certain diseases. I think the more relevant models and the more interesting ones are actually coming out of India and Bangladesh, some of which have been adopted by Africa and some of which have been adopted by Latin America. That's microcredit, huge increases in use of family planning, for example, in Bangladesh. It's a very conservative country. And then a number of other models as well. Girls' education, the whole BRAC model out of Bangladesh. So in a lot of ways, I think that's probably more relevant than what Latin America can give sub-Saharan Africa.
If I could just add one thing to that. One thing that's already been exported from Latin America to Africa is something that's been mentioned before, is these conditional cash transfers. Those were developed in Latin America. It's a new form of aid for the poor and the extreme poor that tries to build long-term human capital by giving aid in traditional manners, handouts or government programs on the condition that your children go to school and get regular checkups. And those have spread like wildfire throughout Africa as well. It's not so clear how great of an impact they make now that we've started to do impacts on them, but it's an innovative new tool from Latin America that has been exported to Africa. Chen, do you want to comment on some of them?
I would like to comment on this question of building institutions. It's so hard. It's so hard. I remember being associated with the Ford Foundation in Peru in the 1960s. In the 1960s, that was the byword, building institutions. And not only Ford in Peru, but Ford generally in Latin America. And they built all kinds of institutions and then watched them fall apart. Even the central bank, the Ford Foundation office in Peru had to do some fancy footwork in New York to justify a grant that they gave to the Central Bank of Peru for education purposes. I mean, who has money more than a central bank? It doesn't sound like it's a place that needs money, but nevertheless, the byword was institution building. We're building an educational institution that's important within the central bank. Well, when the military coup came in 1968, the generals cleared out everybody in the central bank, and so that institution collapsed too. I want to tell a little anecdote that I think will be a source for some optimism. When my wife and I lived in Peru for 3 years, in the mid-90s this was, my wife worked in the education ministry, and she was witness to and victim of all manner of bureaucratic infighting and knife work and total inefficiency of the organization, such that she would come home at night and we would have dinner, and she would plaintively say to me, "Is there any hope for this country?" And I, as an economist, would look at the statistics and realize that the per capita income of Peru in 1995 was exactly what it had been in 1963 when we first went to Peru. And so, and she was aware of that. So we would ask ourselves, I mean, has Peru progressed? Is there any sense of progress that you could see? And I would defend the idea of progress with these 2 points. First of all, the public health situation was vastly improved. Life expectancy was much, much greater in the 90s than it was in the 1960s. And the second thing that I saw was a cadre of an educational elite in Lima mostly, people who had gone to school in the United States, they'd done undergraduate work in the United States, or they'd been graduate students. There were all kinds of sociologists and economists and you name the profession. In Lima, the profession was full of excellently educated people who were creme de la creme in terms of intellectual level on a world scale. That did not exist in the 1960s. In the 1960s, Peru was so far away from everywhere else in the world and so isolated, people did not get that kind of overseas training. These people came back to Peru, they had their professional careers in Peru, they participated politically, and they would not let the ineptitude of the government go unchallenged. There was a foro educativo to challenge the quality of education. There was a foro democrático to challenge the political parties and the political system. They had magazines. They wrote in the newspapers. There was a mobilization of an elite which wanted that country desperately to develop and would not take any answer except development and progress. And I have a great faith in that elite. This is not just a Peruvian story. This is a Latin American story. There is an intellectual elite which is driving each of their respective countries forward, and I have great confidence that they are going to succeed.
You want to comment on the World Bank and the Amazon or anything like that? No? You're not familiar? If I could comment on one of the questions was about the international financial institutions and their record in the hemisphere and prospects for the future. You definitely have to think of the different international financial institutions separately because they're very separate institutions, and the record of the World Bank in Latin America has vastly changed since its founding, especially in relation to the environment. In the very, very beginning of World Bank projects in Latin America, the bank was doing massive infrastructure projects with little to no recognition of the environmental impact of the projects that they were funding. As a matter of fact, most of those projects were the source of massive amounts of environmental problems. However, social movements in Latin America and around the world, and as the world learned about the environmental impacts of economic activity in general, since the World Bank has had some accountability mechanisms that some other institutions don't have, it has vastly improved its relationship with the environment relative to its beginning. It still has a long way to go. A lot of people are still very critical of it, but now for every single investment project there is an environmental impact statement done by the World Bank. When the world leader, when the world signs a treaty such as the Kyoto Protocol or so forth, they have to incorporate that into their mandate. I'm not saying that they're the most environmentally sound organization on the planet, but if you look at its trajectory over time, there's been a vast amount of improvement. And let's hope over the next 35 years that we get even a faster level of improvement. The IMF is a trickier situation. However, I am very optimistic about the communique that we got this weekend over the financial crisis that might signal reform of the IMF that might be better for Latin America. The IMF over the past 25 years has, when countries, and unfortunately Latin America has had many of these external shocks, and have had many of the most famous, unfortunately, financial crises in contemporary history. And when the IMF has gone there, they have put in very austere prescribed very austere economic policies that have more often than not made the country worse off, at least in the initial period, and put in place a set of institutions that make it difficult to get off the ground. The framework that the world leaders expressed this past weekend at the financial summit was towards an environment that recognizes that when you have an extreme external shock and your economy is in really bad shape, that's the time to spend money to get it out of that trap. Right? That's what the United States has done with our big bailout. That's what China has just done with their $500 billion injection. The IMF, for some reason, has said, no, when times are bad, that's when you spend less money. That's when you pull money out of people's pockets and put it into banks and so forth. That's caused a lot of political unrest in the region. In one of my classes, I show the ads that were used by the current president of Argentina to get elected, and all of her ads were against the IMF. Right? The people hate the IMF so bad that they elected a fairly ineffective leader because she was able to just use the IMF as a straw man to get in there. This weekend at the communique, world leaders said that we need to reform the international institutions to make sure that there are counter-cyclical economic policies in place for the world and in developing countries. What does that mean? When things are going really well, that's when you should be more austere. Right? You shouldn't spend a heck of a lot of money. Markets are doing a great job spending money and getting money into the hands of people. You should have tax systems and institutions in place so that when markets start to slow down or if there's a financial crisis, then effective governments with institutions can come in and get economies back off the ground. And one of the core paragraphs in the communique says that we need to reform towards counter-cyclical movements, which actually some of the best economists in the region, Jose Antonio Ocampo, former finance minister of Colombia, is one of the folks who's been, and the United Nations in general, has been pushing for counter-cyclical attitudes towards crises. Finally, it looks like we might get our way as long as that communique is implemented. So IMF and World Bank are two totally different beasts. Should we end there?
Can I come in?
Please, you're the boss.
I just wanted to have if I might, one short substantive comment before I thank people, then a word of apology and a word of thank. Really, thank you for a wonderful panel, but I was standing there thinking from an Asian perspective that there's probably nothing that any of you have said, with the possible exception of the Amazon point, that wouldn't actually also be true for many other, if not all other regions for the world. And after the last 4 weeks, including the US, the point on the institutions is equally valid. So when Carlos was giving his wonderful elaboration, I was thinking you could give that talk on Pakistan. And nothing, and nothing would need to change. And your note of optimism could exactly be true, not for a whole bunch of other countries. And maybe there is more learning than we assume in across these regions. The Amazon was a different sort of very specific point. But a note of apology and then a note of thanks. The bad thing about having a good-sized audience is that the room fills up. And those who come here often have figured out if you're not sitting in the front, the sound is not very good at the back. So apologies from our point of view, and we are actually looking at it. Hopefully from next semester, we'll be doing these seminars downstairs in a space that we are told we will have ready for that very soon. So my apologies, particularly to those at the back. We do understand the sound problem. A note of thanks to all of our panelists for really a truly wonderful discussion, and thanks to Kevin for organizing it and running it. This is really the type of things that we want to foster here at the Pardee Center. This type of interdisciplinary discussion that is bold, looks forward, but is rooted in the realities of both the present and the past. We have a small gift in front of each of you, a little black box. This is not the one that comes after a crash, but something that to remind you of the Pardee Center of. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Another round of applause for our guests. Thank you.